I guess like I want to start off with, I mean, I tried, when I put together this talk, I tried maybe for the first time to connect the research I've been doing for the last 5-6 years with my practice. And it's not, I don't map over each other particularly neatly. But I guess like the kind of the questions that I've been thinking about in both areas, and these questions sound a bit dumb, is like how do new shapes emerge and how do new structures emerge? So it's like the y-axis and the x-axis of everything. And I'm interested in that from an historical point of view. That's kind of where you look at that led me to like focus on revolutions, the kind of material history of ideas, the history of technology, and these kind of shifts in history. And then I'm very practically concerned with it as an opera maker because that's kind of the job. And I recently came across a really beautiful book by Berlant called On the Inconvenience of Other People, which I can thoroughly recommend. And in it, she develops this term called affective infrastructures. And that was the first slide. I'm going to go to the next slide, which is this one. I've started calling this emotional infrastructures. I tried historical sensoriums, but I think affective infrastructures is a really good way of thinking about this. And I don't have the full quote here, so infrastructural affect throws a light onto the generic material kind. The affectivity infrastructure generates is not just in the air or in the gut, or thrown together, or ideology, but specifically involves the sensing of the dimension and extension of what we might call organized air, the projected atmosphere sustained by collective practices. And then she continues, this is going to be relevant later, so I'm going to mention this as well. For example, Shannon Lee Doherty and Madalena Diaconu offer patina as a slowly moving, emerging object scene made from specific usages that come to constitute historical, political, and potential environments. That was a dumb idea. And this is coming across this term has really helped me to fuse the different, I guess, historical methodologies, historiographical methodologies I've been using. And it's opened up a way to think about the history of technology and the history of science a little bit more holistically. That's the end of the intro. I'm going to, this talk has roughly 2 sections. First of all, I'm firstly going to talk about the kind of origin of this research that I've been doing for the last couple of years. And it's research into the origins of meteorology in the 17th century. That became an essay called Ethereal Data, which was published in Catastrophe Time, published by Strange Attractor in 2023. So it's going to be the first part. And then there's going to be a really unneat segue into opera. I'm not sure if it's going to work, but we can talk about that later. Cool. Where are we? We can stay here. The beginning of this research came with some work I was doing for Other Internet, which is a Web3 think tank group that I don't think exists anymore. And I was looking into the history of sovereignty and the kind of allegedly secular history of ideas of sovereignty, how it was constructed and how it aligned to like contemporary notions of international law and the structuring of space and time. And as part of this research, I came across this essay by Lorraine Daston called Unruly Weather from 2003. And in it, she describes what I believe to be the first attempt, in the West at least, to model the relationship between weather and climate. And the story goes that in the mid-17th century, a range of newly established scientific institutions, such as the Académie Royale des Sciences in Paris, set up by the Sun King in the process of centralizing his state, the Royal Society of England, which was set up primarily by the Rosicrucians, like a secret society, and then the Accademia del Cimento in Florence, I'm so sorry for butchering the Italian, which was set up partially with money from the Medici. And at the kind of launch of these institutions, they all started a large experiment which aimed at collating large amounts of data on the weather. And everyone who, in Robert Boyle's words, hath leisure, opportunity, and time, was encouraged to diligently record the daily weather. What was not mentioned is that you also needed a stable abode, a personal clock, some scientific instruments like thermoscopes or barometers to do this. And the idea was that volunteers would write these diaries and then send them off to newly established scientific journals, and then these institutions would collate all of this data. This was primarily made possible by the expansion of colonial empires, because for the first time you could have a weather report from Peru or Macau or something. Weather diaries were not a new thing. We're there. Weather diaries were not a new thing. Seafarers have been keeping them for a long time, but at that point, but what was new about this experiment is that these institutions were interested in connecting land weather, or like land air, to sea air in a way. The other thing that was new was that this was basically the first citizen science experiment prior to there being citizens. And the centralized collection of this data was kind of new about this. And the purpose of gathering all of this data was to extract, and this is a quote by Charles Perrault, who was one of the founding members of the Académie des Sciences, but also wrote fairy tales, tons of fairy tales. That's his kind of side gig. The purpose was to extract general truths whose necessity is subsequently shown by reason to be necessary, or at least linked to other truths, with the aim of deducing from this data the general laws of nature. And the idea was that once you have this universal doctrine, you'd be able to basically solve the problems of all of the religious sects, social unrest, political unrest, because the new laws of nature would emerge from all of this scientific data. Where are we? That's actually... Okay, we'll do this the other way around. But that didn't happen. Because basically, while observers certainly undertook their task with no religious zeal and tenacity, no regular, stable, universal order could be synthesized from this heterogeneous mosaic of thousands upon thousands of weather fragments. The local remained local, weather did not become climate. Not only were barometers and thermostats non-uniform across country and city lines, but after millennia of stories about storm gods, magical stars, and voluptuous rain goddesses, the vocabulary that was used by the weather brethren differed significantly. Storms were a black, sad atmosphere, clouds swollen udders, and snow was very transparent and perpendicular. Some diaries rhymed, others waxed lyrical. And John Locke, which I think is kind of beautiful, he created the universal scale of like how wind works, and he basically just sat in front of a window every day, looked at the same tree and the leaves, and then said like, it's a 1 when the leaves move a little bit, 2 when they're little bit more, and then 3 when the tree is also shaking. So you basically had this kind of gigantic amount of jumbled up data that could not be used for anything, which I think is quite beautiful. The only kind of real outcome of this project was this map. This is Edmund Halley's map of the trade winds in which he basically condensed data that he got from seafarers and some of these weather diary writers and produced this map of the winds of the world. And he was also the first one to correctly identify the impact of solar heating on the movement of air on the planet. This is not an accurate map, but it was like the first kind of map that mapped the winds. So while they kind of failed based on their own terms, I do think it's interesting if we think about these as like this as an attempt to create a new rhythm in which a new way of organizing time, and also a new sort of affective set of ideas around what measuring time, what observing the world requires. And in that, they're kind of quite similar to I guess like medieval monks, because it required this organization of time, which required continuity. And so alongside weather observation, the whole idea of observing the world came to be connected to being moderate, to regulate, to be measured. Now, when I first came across this essay, I got quite annoyed, because as quite often in the history of science, there's never a mention of economics, there's never a mention of politics, and you get the sense that people just come up with stuff out of nowhere. And then when I tried to find primary sources and kind of trace this world, I came across what is known as the general crisis of the 17th century. And I just want to briefly paint like a patina, I guess like you could call it, of what the situation was in which these weather diary networks came to be. So we know that, okay, other way around. We know that temperatures during the Little Ice Age dropped by 1 degree, and there are varieties of causes for that. One of them is should we go back? One of them is the disappearance of sunspots from the face of the sun, which reduced the energy of the sun, and therefore and contributed to the coolness of the Earth. There was an eruption of a volcano in Peru, which apparently made shadows seem fainter and a little bit orange. Glacial expansion started in the late 16th century, and 0.15 degrees of this cooling can be attributed to the genocide of the indigenous population of South America, because where human settlements used to be, trees started to regrow. And all of this happened within a span of sort of 30 years. This is just a fun fact, the Maunder minimum goes from 1635 to 1715, which is exactly the same, which is exactly the reign of the Sun King, which I think we always thought was quite nice. But basically, this change came about at an insane speed. This was less than a generation, and coincided with religious wars. So basically, you had like the entire geological, nutritional, social, political infrastructure that people had been used to for centuries just changed immediately. People were freezing to death in the streets in central Germany. Frozen birds were falling from the sky. Historic droughts became more severe. Locust swarms started to appear in areas where they'd only been known from the Bible. There was price inflation and there were typhoid epidemics, and that's not even to mention the 30 Years' War and the kind of ravages of that. And this wasn't only in Europe. This crisis can also be traced in basically on every continent of the world. And what this expansion of the colonial trade networks had done is that people became aware of the fact that it wasn't just them that had these problems, that it was the entire world. Now, I wish I would be able to go back to show some of these quotes, but we're in QLab and that's not possible. Or is it possible? No, actually, I might just quickly leave and go back here. Sorry about that, because I think they're quite beautiful. This is the first one, is from a book from 1643 called El Nicandro, and it says, "Sometimes Providence condemns the world with universal and evident calamities, whose causes we cannot know. This seems to be one of the epochs in which every nation is turned upside down, leaving some great minds to suspect that we are approaching the end of the world. We have seen all the north in commotion and rebellion, its rivers running with blood, its populous provinces deserted, England, Ireland, Scotland aflame with civil war. What area does not suffer? If not from war, then from earthquakes, plague, and famine." And then on the other side, I won't read these out, but there's a folk song from Shenzhen that expresses something very similar. And then another quote from Wales, because that's an important place. So I think before this background, this kind of scenic background, I started thinking about these weather diary networks differently. It's like, rather than a kind of scientific experiment with the aim of deducing general truths from nature, it seems more like a problem, like a response to a massive crisis. And they were obviously not the only ones who were trying to deal with this. And that brings me to, we're going to go through this. These guys. These guys were known as, there was a movement we only know it as a movement because the people who did these weather diary networks, the scientific rationalists, decried this as like another plague that's befalling the world, and they called them the enthusiasts. But it wasn't really a connected movement. It was multiple tiny new organizations all across Europe. And they were characterized, at least by their opponents, by a dangerous form of belief in the supernatural, the magical, and the occult. And one of the key ideas was that the mere fact that they did not acknowledge time being linear because of the forms of prayers that they used and their way of dealing with history showed them as mad. A couple of examples are, so in France, there's a peak of people people basically bringing non-human agents back into the kind of legal framework. There are cases of locusts being taken to court, heifers being celebrated. In Paris, there were debates around whether if there is a god that has counterfactual knowledge. That was really stressful for everyone. In Italy, the exorcists were having a shit time because their job was basically taken over by these people called good walkers, who were farmers, prostitutes, and kids who gave out curses and cures to people who were suffering. And most famously in England, you have the diggers, the ranters, the Muggletonians, the Shakers, the Quakers, the Levellers, and the Ranters, who are all small Protestant groupings, who all in their own way, some of which have like very proto-socialist characteristics. Others basically refused that were basically like proto-queers. Others were thinking about like commoning the land. And one thing that I thought was really beautiful is that in a lot of their prayers, the idea was that they tried to find a way of mourning a future that had not yet come to pass. And that was also the reason why they were persecuted. Now, I've started to think about these two groupings as... Where are we going next? Cool. That's right. Different ways of the weather diary people, folks, and the enthusiasts as different ways of structuring time and space. I've used Lorraine Daston's term collectives of space or collectives of time, and they both respectively were responses to the crisis. They both found ways of how to face the planet and each other. Whereas with the weather diary networks, it's kind of interesting because while they kind of failed in many ways, but then the infrastructures that they laid down, is like the kind of intellectual infrastructures that were laid down, were then picked up again in the 1770s by one of the OGs, old granddaddies of liberalism, Gore, who tried to basically quell social unrest by creating something that he said would be a bit like the weather, would summarize all of the information necessary in order to solve problems, and he called it the general market, and that's like one of the origin stories of the general market story. These kind of small groupings, the ones that didn't die, a lot of them did. A large part went to the States, and I guess can be held responsible for the genocide of the Native Americans. But I guess that's a kind of, you can call that a success story of something happened to them, I guess. And I think, lastly, it kind of made me rethink the way that we think about modernity, and because I guess modernity is one of those, it's kind of common knowledge that you think of modernity as this crack, and there's you've got secular, civilized, hard, white, cold, technological on one side, and then on the other side you have pre-modern, mystical, sacred, blah 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 blah. And I think this kind of mountain range, this kind of way of dividing time in almost patriotic way, is kind of quite a dangerous way of thinking about time, both individually and collectively. And I had this really nice Reza Negrestani quote. This is from a 2022 talk, which he entitled, "We do not need to be saved from a world we could have, of worlds and humans." The time cops tell us, give yourself to the vagaries of the future, but we are fixed in the past. We think about the future as a host of possibilities, but we never think of the past in the same vein. And I think if you look at this moment in time, the crisis of the 17th century and these groupings, they appear not as separated by time, but separated by space, and defining, and I guess see how that changes it, right? I lost the page with the conclusion, so I'm just making this up. Cool, I think this is the segue into opera. I had a feeling that this wouldn't work. I guess the way that I think about opera is a way of creating quite strange worlds with a group of people, and opera has this kind of quite magical way of rendering everything the kind of affective expressions that we know from film or from theater, rendering that strange. Because once you put words to sound, something strange happens to time. So I use it as a kind of shape and as a form of I guess, worlding in that sense. They're insanely expensive and really cumbersome to make. And so that kind of, I guess, like, yeah, my kind of intro into thinking about economics in a kind of more interesting way has kind of come from there. Yeah, I think there is, it's a shape that I've been thinking through, and now I kind of can't really remember where I was going to go with this, but that's fine. I think like I just want to, I guess like this is the kind of map that I've been using as a teaching tool to teach kids about opera and to get them to think more critically about what you see on stage and all the kind of the ways, the kind of infrastructures you need in order to get there. I guess I just want to, I'm not sure what time it is, but I just want to finish at a place where I guess like in the context of this talk, I just wanted to say that I don't think operas or histories or like those kind of forms of thinking are going to necessarily change the world. Maybe LARPing will, I don't really know. But I think like I've been finding it very hard to kind of think of this way of working and thinking as valuable, especially over the course of last year. So I'm just going to share this here. But in the meantime, I think, you make things with other people, and that's kind of always a good thing. Thinking together, collective learning, collective making is like ultimately a good thing. And I'm going to leave you just with this. Thank you.
I want to be as helpful as possible. I'm just going to have a sip of water.
In explaining why things have turned out as they are, and I take every responsibility for the actions that were taken, the decisions that were made, which could not have been foreseen at the time, and were entirely appropriate based on the information available.
With the benefit of hindsight, would I have done things differently?
Where did it all begin?
Yes. Yes, I would. We are all in this together.
On a day-to-day basis.
And so are the other organizations in our sector.
We live in a world in which all of us are engaged.
This reminds me of something you said earlier, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Appreciate the opportunity to set the record straight and explain why we ultimately could not have prevented what has now happened.
I'm here to be as helpful as I possibly can, and then I want to take your questions.
Then I want to take your questions.